Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see people slowly hopping on to this session. Welcome to Flow, Emergence, and Creating Community, Exploring Democratically Engaged Assessment and Fellowship, which is part of Imagining America's national gathering. It's an honor to be here. My name is Erica Cole-Arenas. I'm the faculty director of Imagining America and a longtime friend and supporter of the APPS group. So it's my honor to introduce this session. Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself as we go. You can also use the chat as a forum to make comments, share resources, ask questions. So please do feel free to talk with one another and introduce yourselves. APPS, Assessing the Practices of Public Scholarship, is a research collective that seeks to reclaim assessment to empower ourselves and our colleagues and communities and on campuses to stand in the gap and help close it with integrity, confidence, and a sense of agency. APPS is chaired by Julia Metzger and Sarah Stanlick, who will co-facilitate this session today. So we're excited to have them here with us. I am personally really excited to learn about how APPS has been engaging with the idea of emergent strategy. Several of you may have read the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown that has a theory of emergence that looks at how we can create really large systemic changes by very small, intentional human and relational actions. And it builds upon, longstanding work of movement scholars, Grace Lee Boggs, Ella Baker, also kind of ideas of radical ecology. And when I heard that APPS would be using the ideas of emergent strategy, I got so excited and curious. And given my engagement with APPS every year at our national gathering and a couple other spaces we've worked together, to me, it's such a perfect fit for a group that spent so much time building a connective learning community, and also that really looks at how to shift some of the problematic notions of evaluation and assessment that are competitive, that are structural, that are short-term, to look at longer haul practices of democratic engagement, of radical inclusion, of relationship building as a way to really transform that work. So I'm really excited to learn with you all today. With a generous grant from our friends at Bringing Theory to Practice, APPS has moved forward with a fellowship program as well to expand their learning community. So you'll hear from a diversity of voices today. So without further ado, I will introduce our facilitators and turn it over. Julia Metzger joined APPS in 2016, seeking assessment methodologies that aligned with the values of service learning and community engagement. She serves as the director of the Washington Center for Improving Undergraduate Education on the Evergreen State College campus in Olympia, Washington. And also Sarah Stanlick will be facilitating as well, who joined APPS in 2015, brought there via community engaged scholarship and with a deep concern about the word impact and how assessment can reinforce savior and deficit narratives. She's a faculty member at the Worcester Polytechnic Institute and the director of the first year Great Problems Seminar. So it is my honor to turn it over to our APPS co-facilitators. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Erica. I really appreciate that lovely introduction. I also noticed that Mina encouraged folks to introduce themselves in the chat, and I'd just like to boost that because we would love to know more about who's here with us in this virtual space. So Sarah and I are really delighted to welcome all of you to this virtual dialogue. The APPS group has spent the last year or so engaged in a very wide-ranging exploration of the ways in which assessment can be reclaimed as liberatory practice. We are especially excited about the incredible work that our 6 APPS fellows are engaged in, and you will get a chance to hear a story from many of them after Sarah offers some introductory framing about our group. You also have a chance to dive into your own exploration as you begin to develop your own assessment story. But first, an important value we hold is one of radical inclusion. It is important to us as a collective that we recognize and honor the history that brought us to this moment. We come from many places with many histories, and we bring many lived experiences. Each of our stories matter. In a moment, I will read a land and a labor acknowledgement that I use in my work at the Washington Center. And I am sure that many of you use similar acknowledgements in your own work. So if you are able and you have it handy, I invite you to share yours in the chat or a link to yours in the chat. The first acknowledgement I will read is the land acknowledgement that we used at the Evergreen State College. It is specific to the land on which Evergreen is located. And I encourage you to take this moment to reflect on the history of the land where you are located right now. If you aren't sure, Sarah will be posting a link in the chat to the Native Lands Finder. No matter where we are in the United States, we are on the land of Indigenous peoples. The Evergreen State College is located on the ceded territories of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which include the Squaxin Island Tribe, the Nisqually Indian Tribe, and the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. The Olympia area was historically a center for trade and exchange among many Salish Sea tribes, including the Chehalis, the Skokomish, and others. With this awareness, we honor the ancestors and pay respect to elders of past and present of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes and to all Native peoples of this land. The second acknowledgement I'll be reading is a labor and justice acknowledgement that we developed this summer for our work in the Washington Center. It is very much a work in progress, and I welcome your feedback or examples of how you acknowledge racial injustice in your own work. We acknowledge the history of this nation is fraught. For too long, this country has elevated a story of democracy and freedom while minimizing the impact of violence and oppression on marginalized communities, communities on whose stolen labor this nation was built. Today, members of Black, Indigenous, Asian, and other communities of color experience racism through inequitable access to education, health, and fiscal services, police brutality, mass incarceration, deportation, and other forms of subjugation. At the Washington Center, we aim to disrupt the legacy of systemic racism by centering racial equity and justice in our work. This is how we stand with our communities of color. White supremacy, the ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of people of color, dehumanizes, widens the opportunity gap, and hurts all of us. So before I turn the virtual mic over to Sarah, I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce the members of APS. And as I do that, I want to note that there are really wonderful introductions and acknowledgements coming in the chat. And I encourage you to kind of scroll through those and take a look at them. Most of our members are here today, and you'll hear from many of us, but not all of us, because as you can see, we're a pretty big group. So I'm gonna go ahead and read the names and institutions that our members come from. And you might wanna scroll through the list of participants to see if you can find them. And if you know them, I encourage you to send them a little bit of a chat message. So we have a core group that have been working with apps for a while. And this group co-authored a white paper that is on the Imagining America website, which is a place where you can learn a lot more about the work that we've done. These are Joe Bandy from Vanderbilt University, Anna Sims Bartell from Cornell, Patty Clayton from PHC Ventures, IUPUI, UNCG, and many others. She may be known to many of you. Myself from the Evergreen State College, Mary Price from IUPUI, Sarah Stanlick from WPI, and Stephanie Etheridge Woodson from Arizona State University. And as I mentioned, we are delighted to have recently welcomed our research fellows into the fold, who, if they didn't know now, they are now members of the APS group. And they are Joe Garcia from La Placita Institute, New Mexico, Glenn Hughes from the University of Richmond, Janice McMillan from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, Cheryl Seamers from Kenai Peninsula College in Alaska, LaShonda Crow-Storm from Spirit in Place in Indianapolis, and Brandon Whitney, formerly of IOB. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to give us a bit of framing for our session today.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. And I'm just going to pop in now the links to our white paper, our app's website, and the Slack channel that we can share beyond this time together. So hopefully this is a really nice overview, story sharing, and a comfortable space for everybody just to be together. But we also didn't want to overwhelm you with all the theory, all the concepts, all the everything that we've been thinking about for, anywhere from 5 years to a decade. So in order to make this kind of a flexible space, we'll share those things, park them from now, and just give this light framing to introduce us into the day. So today's journey, we're going to work through using the beautiful flow imagery that pervades the gathering this year. We wanted to think of this time together as a river. So we're going to frame our community of co-inquiry, talk a bit about how our group came together. We will then provide some space for story sharing, especially from our fellows who joined us this year, to rise up some of the issues that are going on in their own context and the intersecting ways in which emergent strategy and democratically engaged assessment may speak to their particular contexts. We're going to invite our participants, all of you, our audience, friends, colleagues, Sea of Love, to share their own stories about kind of tension holding, especially between the organizations that we're a part of, the larger societal context, and the work that we want to do in the place that we want to make this world. And then finally, we'll do some closing reflection, think about nuts and bolts. What do we take out of this in terms of, we've done story sharing, we've thought through some of the theory. What are the ways that we practically apply some of the things that we talked about today? And then we'll close with a beautiful poem by David White. So hopefully this sounds like what you all signed up for. We're excited to talk with you today. So starting here, Adrienne Maree Brown's work, Emergent Strategy, spoke to us in a way because we've been trying to think through how do we both make space for resilience, for going with the flow, for generativity, but also find these like microstructures and tiny waves. I know our colleague Patty talks about nudging the world towards what we want it to be. And this quote from Adrienne Maree Brown really spoke to me and hopefully others. Very specifically, the bolded here, I'll read aloud. Small circles rooted in love, relinquishing control and offering love, mundane practices as acts of love, humility in the face of the unknown as self-love, seeing and shaping the whole not as a million overwhelming waves, but as a sea, this is collective love, and living in generosity and gratitude every day is living love. Being nature is being love. And hopefully that is the type of supportive environment that we've been building through this fellowship over the last year. And so I'll briefly give a little overview about the fellowship opportunity. As Erica mentioned earlier, we had a Bringing Theory to Practice grant that was given to us prior to the pandemic. So we had these big, bold ideas of a research institute and gathering people together over food and discussion and dialogue. And then, as you all know what happened, the pandemic came and we had to kind of repivot and rethink. So in that time, we've been spending the last few years thinking about reimagining assessment. So how can we take assessment in this high stakes environment that we're all in, whether we're in philanthropy and community groups, in higher education, the stakes of being able to tell your story well, and the stakes of being able to have somebody else understand the work that you're doing as important, as justice-oriented, and as impactful is a type of power. So we've been rethinking and going through this process of how do we reclaim and reimagine assessment as not checkbox making or not satisfying a larger oppressive technocratic overlord, but rather as something authentic and radically inclusive. So at the same time, we're also responding to this current moment of pandemic, racial injustice, white supremacy, ecological disasters. How do you move forward in this world that seems so horrible in so many ways and that keeps throwing more and more obstacles and challenges at us in ways that are productive? So our challenge for building this fellowship in a virtual space, trying to keep going amidst all of the real struggles and hard parts, How do we lift each other up? How do we sometimes just sit with each other and create things in the moment together? We didn't want to have an overly structured opportunity to work together. We wanted some bounds around it, but we wanted to have that freedom and that space to really create and to co-inquire together. And so that's where Emergent Strategy came in. We've been thinking about assessment. We've been so focused on that. And then we were thinking about, well, the operationalization, like what does this look like as we translate it into our context and into our everyday, so those mundane things that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about. So one way that we've been conceptualizing this work as to like what its larger end is through this idea of the tragic gap. And Parker Palmer, I won't read this quote out, but speaks to this challenge of what happens when the world, as you envision it, is not as the world as we encounter it. And so he calls that the tragic gap. So we were wondering, our question to each other, how can our fellowship help us to support each other in holding that tension productively? And so we started to think about the tragic gap as more of an opportunity gap. We don't want to feed the crisis. We don't want to go back to normal. The normal before pandemic wasn't just equitable, loving, kind, thriving, any of those things. So is this an opportunity to kind of, amidst the chaos, hold a space of calm, have some focused positive action, think about that tragic gap and really stand there boldly, and then look at how we could break this cycle of anger, frustration, malaise in some instances, exhaustion, violence, through assessment, storytelling, positive collective power building, just sharing who we are, where we are, and what are our dreams and visions for the future, who's around the table, who's not around the table, what are those different pieces that we need to attend to move and nudge the world forward. And so our conceptual resources that we've focused on in this time was democratically engaged assessment and emergent strategy. So through DEA, which is a framework for challenging normative structures of assessment, it is deeply rooted in those democratic civic engagement principles. It is values engaged, it is collaborative and co-creative and adaptable across many contexts, much like Emergent Strategy. Emergent Strategy is a framework specifically for resistance and transformation. It's focused on collective power and collective leadership. So Emergent Strategy can be, for some of us, kind of a conceptual mindset for how to move society forward. Democratically engaged assessment can be a framework for how do we assess, tell stories, call in, and build that power together. So we thought that these paired really nicely. And so some of the interacting elements of Emergent Strategy that really spoke to us were pieces that could map onto DEA very, very clearly. The idea of iterative processes, that transformation just doesn't happen in a click. It happens over time and through persistent work. That we need to be resilient and that we can harness each other's personal power, both in collection and in our individual nature, to work through these horrible things that were on the pandemic slide of doom we had earlier. There's so many things plaguing. How do you keep going? And Emergent Strategy, I think, really called to us in an important way in thinking about this and putting some language around it. And I don't know if my colleague Patty, did you want to talk a bit about the transformational strategies of DEA?
I can do that. Good afternoon, everyone. So Sarah has already shared just a little bit about the white paper that our team produced a few years ago on democratically engaged assessment. And one element of that we, as our whole team, has found particularly useful as we've been together in community, is a set of ideas around how to hold tension in this gap in ways that are generative, that are transformational, that help us not shut down, that help us not run away and pull the blanket over our head, that help us not cast blame on others, but assume responsibility. And so this slide calls from that work. What is this there? 10 elements of how we've thought about transformational strategies for holding tension in this gap. You see the headings of each of the 10 here, just to point to a couple of them. Designing structures and processes. So if we build into our days, if we build into our meeting agendas, if we build into templates for how we schedule things, any structures and processes that can become our defaults that are about helping us hold tension in generative ways. Checks and balances, for example. I guess one more, the top right corner, the strategy of looking past conflicts and exploring the bigger, the broader, the more fundamental shared visions and purposes and values. It can be so easy to get frustrated and angry and caught up in our different orientations to values, our different conclusions on an important issue. But if we'll hold ourselves and others out the possibility of what behind or underneath that we might share, that can help us transform the conflict. So encourage you to, as we have, to think about these strategies as lenses to help understand how we engage tension and how we want to try to engage it. It can be difficult to be transformative as we stand in that gap, but we're trying to understand how.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patty. And I think in fellowship, we had the opportunity to share stories of our own contexts and our own lives in ways that illuminated that sometimes we have a lot of assumptions about each other, about where we're coming from, and about the values we might hold paramount to others. And that often shakes out not to be true. It's not a bad thing. It's just something to understand and to productively work through. So having some of these transformational strategies at the forefront, I think, for me at least, I'll speak for myself, can help you move through some of those barriers and those challenges. So, all right. So just very quickly to summarize before we move on to hearing from our colleagues and friends. Here's our productive fellowship group in the center here. Julia made this beautiful visual. We are constantly under kind of attack of the world as it is. There are hard things, there are rough things, but there are also opportunities for us to really stand in that tragic gap between what is and what could be, by leveraging conceptual frameworks like emergent strategy and like democratically engaged assessment. And what you're going to hear next from our colleagues are some specific vignettes about their own context, about which one of those elements and values and transformational strategies really spoke to them in their context, and how they've worked through the gap in their own kind of lives. And I will throw it over to our colleague, Joe Bandy.
Everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joe Bandy. As Sarah said, I work at the Vanderbilt Center for Teaching and in the Department of Sociology, and was former co-chair of APS and been involved for, gosh, going on a decade now in APS's work. It's my privilege to transition to the APS Fellows and their stories of living in the gap and struggling for transformation. As we do that, I just want to introduce to you the idea of how you might listen to these stories. The listening guide that we have here would merely recommend that you begin to think a little bit as you hear these stories about any similarities or differences to your own context, and listen for areas of transformational strategies that might apply to your context, things that may resonate with your own feelings of standing in the gap and working to make the world as you imagine it. And with that, I'll hand it off to Glenn Hughes of the University of Richmond. Go Spiders.
Hi, everyone.
We can hear you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the title of my story is Urgency Got Us Into This Mess. And here's a passage from Emergent Strategy. There is such urgency in the multitude of crises we face. It can make it hard to remember that, in fact, it is urgency thinking, urgent, constant, unsustainable growth that got us to this point, and that our potential success lies in doing deep, slow, intentional work. My story takes place in an elite, selective, persistently white university where, and there is no way to say this without irony, I, white guy, am the Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion. This is my third role at the university in 19 years. With relatively little power or authority, one way of understanding my job is to change an institution that cannot actually fathom the change that it needs. Kind of like the white person confronting their implication in racism for the first time, or like I was when I confronted my own. It is not about creating a checklist action plan so that you can avoid the accusation and get back to the comfort of being yourself. The longer realization is that you are not whole. You are not who you thought you were. There is an unknown that must be confronted, contradictions to resolve. Sorry, I want to say it to the institution, who I am imagining as a white guy. You cannot keep your commitment to neoliberalism and be an anti-racist. One morning about 5 years ago, I was in the audience with 50 or so colleagues listening to one of the finalists for the job of provost. The new provost would be the 6th on campus in 10 years. I was thinking I might be able to ask one question during the 30-minute Q&A. I was trying to think of a question that would be unanswerable if the candidate had less than a deep, nuanced grasp of structural racism. I was hoping for a new provost who would get it. I had been in this situation and had these feelings many times before. I don't remember the question I asked, but I know I was disappointed with the answer. In my sulking, it occurred to me that I was spending way too much energy hoping for savior leaders, so many of whom I had already outlasted, that my hope could be better directed. I should have actually realized that earlier. It took a long time. For at least 3 years before that particular provost search, I'd been scheming with colleagues on my campus, and inspired and sustained by Imagining America, it seems relevant to add. To actually do some of the long-range thinking about how the institution should be. We imagined in detail what the campus would actually be like far into the future if it became an anti-racist institution. Then we started planning our imagination battle and putting it into motion, seeding the ideas with more and more colleagues. Lots of power mapping, regrouping, and redirecting the efforts. We were doing all of that because we saw the constant turnover of leaders as one aspect of a market-driven commitment to quick, brand-worthy wins. We could say that commitment is a white supremacist commitment because it makes it impossible to make an honest commitment to anti-racism. With every new provost or dean or president comes a new action plan full of 1 or 2 year deliverables, more urgency thinking, go, 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 speed and churn. Sometimes though, if you're ready for change, the turnover is a blessing. A few years ago, working with our first Black president and our network of people in the institutional middle, eager for long-range transformation, we proposed and we successfully proposed an atypical structure for institutional DEI work. One key feature of the structure is an institutional council connected to the president's cabinet, designed to outlast the tenures of individual leaders, and specifically charged to shape and sharpen the institution's focus on long-haul anti-racist work. But it may not last. I mean, it probably won't last. Or maybe it will last, but in a contorted form that calls for us to abandon it. The point is, we've tasted a new possibility and we can adapt. Speaking of which, we already have a new president whose recent arrival is likely to usher in a new round of leadership turnover. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. All right. Next up, we have a video, or well, we have an audio recording from our colleague, Janice McMillan, who's an associate professor at the University of Cape Town. who has been working on intersecting issues of global citizenship, anti-racism, and leadership studies. And so the title of her reflection is What Changes and What Stays the Same? So I'm going to go ahead and start the audio. I would love a thumbs up from, I see Julia, Joe, and Patty, if just to make sure that you hear this. Okay.
Past 8 months in engaging with colleagues on the apps project, several key questions I had in my mind I was able to work through. And the one question I have is, in the COVID context, what changes? What stays the same? Or a subtitle for me is thinking differently about leadership and opening up to vulnerability. A bit about me. I'm a white cisgender female from a settler family living with much privilege in a context in South Africa, where while levels of absolute poverty have decreased, inequality has risen exponentially over the past couple of decades. And then COVID came, and many of the deep issues in the post-apartheid context were rendered visible in new and very raw ways. Examples being unemployment, gender-based violence, food security, and lack of safety for many. This got me thinking about democratically engaged assessment and emergent strategy and the link of those to leadership, and ultimately to a new kind of self. During the fellowship, this has involved listening generously to others and their stories, listening deeply and with empathy. The activity of storytelling is an important process as noted in the DEA white paper. In addition, the current moment with COVID has made me aware that it is not only about what we might know or what we might be able to do. It's not about knowing or doing. It is fundamentally about being, about engaging in very relational and intentional ways. Finally, my last piece is about vulnerability. If we are putting being at the center of our engagement and understanding of the world, a key quality and tension we need to lean into is the possibility of accepting our own vulnerability, even as leaders. For some, leadership is intimately linked to vulnerability. As David White says, if you are a leader, you are visible. If you are visible, you can be seen. If you can be seen, you can be touched. And if you can be touched, you can be heard. And he continues in his Consolations book, vulnerability is not a weakness, a passing indisposition, or something we can arrange to do without. Vulnerability is not a choice. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. To attempt to be invulnerable is a vain attempt to become something we are not, and most especially to close off our understanding of the grief of others. The only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate. In Adrienne Marie Brown's work on emergent strategy, vulnerability is also a key dimension. As she asks, do you understand that your quality of life and your survival are tied to how authentic and generous the connections are between you and the people and place you live in? Are you actively practicing generosity and vulnerability in order to make connections between you and others clear, open, available, durable? Generosity here means giving of what you have without strings or expectations attached. Vulnerability means showing your needs. So to conclude, things will always be changing, and the need to act, to work and lead for justice. This remains. These are the constants. However, I have come to understand that how we frame our engagement with change, how we open ourselves up to embracing change in order to lead in new, ever-changing realities, requires us to accept vulnerability and to accept emergence as two constants. As Marie Brown says, change will always be with us. Emergent strategy is how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated world we long for. Thank you.
All right. So I believe next up is our colleague, Joe Garcia. Joe, if you'd like to unmute and share with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Garcia, and I'll be sharing how I feel and how we have been working as a collective about holding the space and using emergent strategy and standing in the gap, especially now during these times that we're in or that we've been in. And even before the pandemic, there was a lot of things that we were going through that we knew was not right. It's almost like the illness of humanity that underlies everyone and can surface through anyone at any time. So it's up to each individual to keep that in mind and be conscious of it, so that each person has the ability to be above it and to conduct themselves in a way that is intentional and is different from what we see as the madness of humanity. I feel like standing in the gap, to me, in my opinion, is a time to be the most calm and be the most focused. This is a personal, and it'll also be a collective decision, but it is also an opportunity to be of service for the common good of the earth, animals, plant life, and humanity. Again, not returning to the normal way it used to be, because that was way short on potential. Now is the opportunity for a co-created renaissance. A renaissance without struggle. I feel a lot of energy, the second law of thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, it applies to us as humans. It's not just something out in outer space somewhere, but in our lives, what does the conservation look like, when it's applied intentionally, and it's without struggle, without being in combat mode to achieve what's right, without having to be crawling along as like an infantry person, trying to dodge landmines and being fired upon, trying to get to their goal, to reach a certain destination. But it's rather when it's applied in a flow that's in alignment with the great energy of life, the energy that creates worlds and draws up life itself, where we have no debate needed to prove what's right, because what's right already is. We have to align ourselves and be it now. It's not something way out in the future, one day. We've been here, one decade, 1 century later. How long has humanity been in the struggle for what's right? We have to just be it now. Otherwise it'll always be moving further and further as we think we're getting closer to it. So, an example I always think of is from the movie Star Wars, where Obi-Wan Kenobi is in battle with Anakin Skywalker, and he says, and I'm sure everyone who's seen the movie can remember this specific scene, but it's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. And then Anakin responds, "You underestimate my power," speaking from the ego, right? And then Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Don't try it," and so that's where we have to be. We're like, the Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, "Don't try it," because as intimidating, as powerful as fear and all kinds of other oppressive ways of thinking and being to try to oppress others, it seems really intimidating. It seems like it has a power, but it's really a false power. And so, when you stand on the high ground in every situation, you'll always have the advantage. And that's something I feel, personally, but also collectively, we can do that. And it's about taking that stand right now at this time and being that sea of love. You know, we can't be a sea of love. All of a sudden we're angry one time, and then we're a sea of love, and then we're angry again, and we're going to break stuff, and we're going to burn stuff down, and then we're going to be back to the sea of love. It's like, choose it and do it, you know, and then you'll experience it. But if we continue to stay, you know, like one foot in each place, then we're never going to really experience it. We're always going to be in the struggle, and the struggle, like say if a boa constrictor or some kind of python was wrapping around us, the more we struggle, the more tighter the grip gets, and the more we suffocate, the more it's choking us out, and we're trying to struggle. And it's like, no, use your mind, and you know, as humanity, we have full potential to do something way better and take the high ground. So those are my thoughts, and you know, it stands with Parker Palmer, you know, standing in the gap and being there at this time for not only ourselves, but for the humanity now, and also humanity in the future, our generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I believe that Patty has a statement from our colleague Cheryl in Alaska. Patty, I'll also unshare because I know that you had her photo that you wanted to pop up too. So I'll move that over.
Let me get that up.
Oh, there you go.
Yes, can you all see?
Perfect.
So this is Cheryl. You see her picture now?
Yes.
Great, okay. So Cheryl Seamers is another of the APP's research fellows. She is actually on an airplane right now on her way to a family wedding. So she sends her regrets. She's the director of Kenai Peninsula College, which is part of the University of Alaska system. Cheryl has lived in and loved Alaska for much of her life. And that experience nurtures and grounds her focus on place. She's done some work on what she calls place-engaged community campus engagement. She incorporates both local and indigenous methodologies in teaching. She's done some research on place-committed education and has helped to launch initiatives that diversify teaching models and that help to make higher ed in Alaska more accessible to more people. So that's sort of how she comes into this community. And here's the story that she asked if I would share today on her behalf. So I hope the dissonance between my voice and her picture isn't too much. So from Cheryl, I have enjoyed immensely being part of a fellowship, but more importantly, I am learning to fellowship, to put into practice in verb form the idea of grounding our work in authenticity, transparency, vulnerability, in community with one another, to share deep, real, meaningful parts of our lives, both our personal lives and our professional lives, in ways that we support each other in moving our work and ourselves forward. For me individually, this has been critical, particularly in this moment and in this gap that we're living in. Like so many other people, I opted for major life change in the middle of the pandemic. I relocated, same town, but different home. I took a very different job, becoming director of KPC, which meant leaving my faculty rank, my teaching role, my prior professional identity in many ways, and launching into an administrative role in which I intended to continue to make a difference, but without leaving behind all that I had been and all that I believed in. I wanted to bring my whole self, including my commitments to community engaged work, albeit in a new capacity and standing in a new way in my place. Most importantly, I wanted to learn to balance my personal and professional lives, the range of my commitments, and being a member of this community gave me a space to work this out with support. I wasn't really even settled on balance when I came into this community as the best way to understand how to hold the tensions I was feeling between personal and professional. And that was exacerbated because I do intend to live meaningfully in my place, a place that, just like so many others, is not what it can be and not what it should be. And I want to do this in all dimensions of my life, not only in personal or professional, and not in ways that are always pushing me and pulling me and ultimately rendering me less effective at trying to help move the world as it is closer to the world it could be. I also want to support our students and our faculty and the members of our local and state community in their own efforts to do the same. So a key strategy for me that this fellowship has helped me to engage with and unpack and use as I try to hold these tensions generatively in my own life is linked to the element from Emergent Strategy called adaptive. The quote for that: how we live and grow and stay purposeful in the face of constant change actually does determine both the quality of our lives and the impact that we can have when we move into action together. This helps deepen my understanding of really how balance wasn't working for me, and to help me revision what I'm trying to do as integration. Integration within so many dimensions of my life. It's through integration that I'm coming to see that I, quote, stay purposeful in the context of constant change. When I'm able to integrate all the things, my quality of life and in turn my agency in the world are deepened, and I feel more powerful. The community of this component of this fellowship that we're in together was critical in me working this out in practical ways. This community helped challenge me and helped me face my own challenges, putting my stories into a greater narrative of what it is to hold tension in this moment. I'll leave with the thought that what lingers for me and where I hope to continue to go in this conversation is how to every day better honor diverse ways of knowing, diverse ways of being in my place, in this community, and in this work of nudging the world more generally. That was Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Patty. Now I'm going to invite LaShonda Crowstorm to be our final fellow sharer.
Greetings all. I'm actually in the middle of a community center, so you may hear chickens, children, and all kinds of things going on. So just bear with me. I am actually the Community Engagement Director at Spirit in Place. And Spirit in Place, we use the arts, humanities, and religion as a vehicle towards community transformation. Our organization is actually located at the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. Although we are within a very hierarchical, all the things you can think about universities, whether you like them or dislike them. We are not a student-facing unit. We were born out of work that dealt with how does religion, 35 years ago, how does religion interact with the urban space? And then what does the urban space's impact on religion? With that being said, we are community generated in terms of our festival, our community-based work, and we are primarily community-facing, although we do interact with the university. And so we have a different bent in regards to how we think about what this work means, how does the work get done, and how do you do the work in spaces and places where you may think the work can't be done. And one of those reasons is we made the choice in a lot of the work in regards to how to do work has to begin with choices. So I'm just going to show a quick screen share because I think it's much easier to kind of visualize our work. This is probably our third year with Imagining America, and it really starts with us talking about our work that deals with powerful conversations on race. And one thing that, and I want to honor that work, but one thing to think about Spirit of Place as a whole is we actually exist in this little bitty area of the K-word, where chaos and order meet. That's literally where we have built our home. That's where we work really well in regards to entering community spaces. And from our worldview, everything is a community space. So whether that's your office, that's your family, your church, your university, it's a community. And how you choose to navigate and work in that community, you have to make those choices. So it doesn't matter for us that we're in an academic institution, because that is a community, and we also live in the community of Indianapolis. And we operate like this by choice, whether we're dealing with the academic side or where we're dealing with the actual in the neighborhoods. I think it's really important to understand that for us, we are an emergent practice. We live at that edge of where we don't know, and we like that space. And so what you're seeing are many of our values here that are rooted in how we choose to do community-based work. These are values that we talk about when we enter community, that we're people-centered, that our focus is really on how does the work that we do serve the people. Because if it doesn't serve the people, then we've kind of missed the boat. That is co-creative, and that's very different from being collaborative in the event sense that you start together with a question and then you build it together. It doesn't mean that you come to the table with the answers. We start together and look at, these are your values, these are my values. This is what's important to you. These are your skills, these are my skills. So what new can we create together? We're really about being generative, and that can be very complex for folks when you bring in these ideas about religion, because we're not interfaith. And so you may have atheists on one end of our table and folks who consider themselves religiously conservative or liberal on another end. They may be Abrahamic, they may not, and all are welcome at our table. You just have to figure out where you want to pull up your chair, but we're not dismissing anyone because no one is going anyplace. And so some of the notions about how do you make a thing if everyone can't be a part of the thing, even if they don't necessarily have your spiritual viewpoint or your worldview about how things should function, then are you really creating something that's generative? And that's a much harder conversations. We do believe in abundance. So we give away a lot of knowledge and a lot of time, because to build community is not necessarily how do I take my skills and make you come to Spirit and Place. It's how do I work with you to help you do what you need to do. And then when it's time for me to do what I need to do, you come and work with me too. So you build the bridge from community back to you, not from yourself to community. We have a more global worldview, that nothing is just about you and your little hamlet or town or university, that it's all interconnected. And what happens globally impacts you locally, and how your local events are connected beyond just your town. And we are emergent. We love to live in that space where we do not know, and we're okay with not knowing. And that's an uncomfortable space for a lot of places. But these are our values, and these are our community engagement principles. And I won't read them all through, but it does mean that giving time, learning to listen, being adaptive at all times, because you want to do A, maybe you do A, and what it shows us is that we need to go to a galaxy far, far away. Or you do A and you really need to go to D because the B that you thought doesn't make sense. And to be able to do that, you have to actually work beyond the commons. And that's this whole notion of let's get down to our common denominator. It just kind of drives us crazy, because the common denominator really is that you breathe, I breathe, you eat, I eat. And sometimes that's all you really have with folks. But you can start with this idea of, how do we come together and build something that we can all benefit from, not just how do we boil it down? Because that gets into a lot of problems, especially when we think about faith work, because we're like, well, every faith believes this. That's not true. Your faith might believe this, or your faith might believe that, or even if faiths share common beliefs, the goal of the individual and their spiritual practice may not be the same. That just might not be the final focus. And so those are ways that we navigate. And because we bring that to the table, this is what happens. this organization here, Keffer Institute, these are all the lines of interaction with them that we had. We began in 2015 with just one application for them to participate in our 10-day festival. That's the yellow line here. That one event then led to a community discussion series that went on for 3 years that was about the processes associated with gentrification. We just went and had a conversation and was like, we know you have this bent toward community. We know that you all have a particular space that's neutral in community. And we know that this is a topic as important to you. We know that from our work, because I run around town, that lots of people in town are afraid to talk about this, although they want to talk about it. And the fear comes from what may happen if their funding gets cut or someone hears them say something. And we know that you're not really worried about that. So what can we do together? And with that comes a 3-year discussion that really talked about the processes of gentrification. That led to all of these new series. It went down here and led to a huge community training process where community decided to stay together after the discussions and be like, well, what is it that we need to know? Well, when that orange sign appears in the lawn, what does that mean? I don't know, but let's have a community workshop about that. All of that continues on. It then turns into the community groups decided to build 5 community task force. That from that, we had another project, and we're always about come along with us again. And this project here in 2017 was really about what are the ways in which arts and artistic processes can actually lead to new opportunities for formerly incarcerated men and women, as well as youth aging out of foster care, because we know those populations are overly institutionalized. And the only way forward is to find different avenues toward economic stability and sustainability that are not rooted in the systems that we currently have. A part of that process is that funding is given to experiments. Be like, you have an idea, well, here's some money, go try it out. So one of those experiments was about how do we work around issues of grief, about how does grief make it really difficult for community members to be stable when you're constantly mourning. And so that particular project led to a whole thing connected to basically women-facing reentry programs. Also, if you'll see in this corner, these 2 different lines of projects over the years then led to a massive explosion of a 2 new community space. But you can't get there if you don't constantly just keep walking forward and be like, well, what next can we do together? Honoring where each other are and what the differences are. Now, with powerful conversations on race, again, it is a community co-creative process. Our role in this is that we find funding to support the training for community, that any issue that arises with the 30, we have 30 facilitators at this point. So when issues arrive, it is the collective, not Spirit in Place, but we are staff. Our job is to find funding. Their job is to do the facilitation work, and we work it together. A problem arises, we work in a consensus fashion where we come together and say, okay, well, how do we address this? Because it's not our responsibility to do it if we're going to transform our community using dialogue around race. It's not just Spirit in Place's job, it's everyone who shows up. And so you can see this is the methodology. And you are welcome to attend because they are online. We have a series of common agreements that we go to. And these agreements come about from working with the facilitators and working with community in regards to figuring out what are the best agreements that we can all agree to at these difficult dialogues. Because keep in mind, some of these dialogues have almost led to fisticuffs. There's crying because race is hard in America, and then you have a choice to show up and do the work or not do the work. Our agreement was that if folks have a desire to come out at 3 o'clock on a Sunday to talk about race, our responsibility is to keep showing up and keep doing the work because community has committed. So we just relaunched the second series. We also talk about, we spend time learning about what is the different ways of communication, because dialogue is not debate, it's not discussion, it's not conversation. This is from Eastern Mennonite University Center for Peace Building and Justice. They have an entire little book series, but we spend time working with community because our goal is for them to take these dialogue skills and go back into their own community. Various ways and sectors, their neighborhood association, go back to your church. We see all those spaces where people take these skills and take them back into those spaces, and they're able to do work well beyond us, which is what we want to see. So we can see, we use what's called the civic reflection dialogue technique, which does use the arts and humanities and documents and things like that as a way to let people into a conversation. So you might have music, you might have videos. Oops, I think I have the wrong presentation up here.
It's okay. LaShonda, and I could listen to you for like an hour and a half. I'm conscious of our time. So I want to give you a minute to wrap up before we go into breakouts.
Yep. So this is my last little thing. I was getting there to my presentation. I had the wrong one. Sorry.
They all
look
amazing.
alike.
No, it's fine.
But what we realized by working in this way and slowly is that this is the impact for the 400 plus odd people who came through this series, and they were coming month after month, is that you see the level of change in understanding of race. 17% a great deal, 39% a lot. That we realized that 100% of people took some form of action. And so it's really up to you to determine what is community, but my belief is every place is community. And whether or not you choose to slow down and figure out how to work with who's around you so that you can build something different, not tweak it, not like get to these common denominators, but literally build something that's totally different from what exists. And it is possible. And these are two examples of how it works on the community side and how it works when we do our community-based dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, LaShonda, as always. So I'm going to ask, oh, I have a friend, sorry, cat photobombing the event. We are going to move to our breakout rooms. And so Papiro is going to set up rooms of about 4 people per room. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen just to give us all a little sense of what's coming up next. So what we're going to ask you all to do, and I shared the prompt and our Jamboard in the chat so you all have it. We are going to do some small group discussion where you kind of think about and take a moment before we break out what resonated, what would you like to challenge or think through a little bit more? Where do you deal with this tragic gap in your own world? So the difference between the world as it is and the world that you wish it to be. And then maybe jot down your story and then we'll discuss that. So the very first thing that we ask you to do as you break out into your room, everybody go around and take a moment to share. This is a story about, fill in your context there, tension between, what are the things that are pulling at you? And where is the opportunity gap that you see? So moving from that tragic tension gap to the opportunity gap. So if you just start there with telling your 2-line story, wonderful. And then as you go along, we'll have some broadcast messages that'll continue to ping you and get you to go a little bit deeper as we go along. And we will come back. I'm thinking our time is getting away from us. So we'll give 15 minutes maybe to at least everybody will get their chance to share their story. And then we'll come back and unpack a little bit and debrief. So Papiro, if you are ready, we can open up those breakout. Oh, look at you. All right, so breakout rooms, please accept, be ready to share your story as comfortably as you would like it. And then we'll call y'all back around 5:05. 5:05 Eastern time. I know that I am in Eastern time zone. Apologies. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So in this last bit, we're going to just do a little bit of share out thoughts. We would love to hear from you about some of what are the things that you surfaced in your stories, what particularly struck you, and then we'll try to move from thinking about the conceptual work to maybe some nuts and bolts. So Patty, do you want me to go to this next slide? Yes. Yeah. All right.
So really these questions build off of the last thing that Sarah sort of pushed out into our groups, implications. What implications do you see in this discussion and the stories we shared and your stories you shared for your work, for our collective work, including if there are particular strategies that would help us stand meaningfully in this gap. Put in the chat if you wish, and we're also a small group, so also just holler out. This is how we help each other stand strongly tomorrow and next week based on the stories we've shared today.
I'm happy to kick us off. I just learned so much from Charlene Martinez in this conversation. Thank you, Charlene. I am struggling with what for many people is a perennial tension, and for me it's taken on new significance about where do I put my time and energy and my faith and trust, understanding those as increasingly scarce resources. And how do we, grieve for the imagined relationships to our institutions, and at the same time recognizing, that it's not. It can feel like we're putting less in, but we may be putting more in elsewhere. And so I don't know. I feel like I have new permission to be. That it's okay to be super intentional about those choices, and that it's okay to pour into the work that is life-giving and withdraw from the work that is not. And I know that seems like really clear and obvious, but I knew it in my head, but I think I'm feeling my way into that as a new kind of wisdom. Wishing so much I could go to Charlene's jellyfish thing tomorrow morning. I hope you all do, because it sounds incredible. Thank you.
Anna, I tried to capture one nugget of that. There were several in there. Feel free to dump them in any of your thoughts in the chat. And thank you for kicking us off. What else? David, I see you grinning. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share from your group's discussion or your own reflection today?
Glenn and I had a great conversation that tracked loosely with the prompts. So I'm grinning a little about that because I feel like we sort of had the deep, if brief, connection that we're aspiring to in our work. And I think that you've done a great job constrained by the format of this virtual setting and sharing really powerful things that APS is doing and thinking about. So I appreciate that. We were reflecting on the challenge of even naming within our institutions the kind of relational work that now needs to happen because people were isolated for 18 months and are now back together, but in a diminished and constrained way. And we're thinking about how do you talk about that in a way, how do you demonstrate the impact of that work in ways that don't undermine it and that don't sell it out.
Hey, Glenn, if you have it ready to hand, that reminds me a little bit of that quote that our group, our community of fellows played with about slowing down. David, what I heard in that was, how do we convince people to take time to reinvest in relationships? And that's one of the ideas related to an idea that Glenn's story kind of bounced off of, had to do with slowing down and valuing the slowdown and investing in what's important. Linked back, Anna, to what you were saying. I don't know, Glenn, do you have that ready to hand? If so, pop it in the chat. Excellent. Our potential success lies in doing deep, slow, intentional work. Yep. Glenn, the author's name would be great to pop in there if you can. Do we have one? Of course. Do we have one more quick, concrete, practical strategy we can support each other with?
And any ideas of what you'll do tomorrow? So we've been through this wonderful discussion together. You've heard from a lot of wonderful colleagues. What happens tomorrow morning, or what happens Monday morning to move this work forward?
Yeah, for me, hi, Charlene. Hi. I just keep thinking about, I think it's both Prentice Hemphill and Adrienne Maree Brown talk about, you become what you practice. And so I just keep thinking about what if we put that on every agenda, or every, anything that requires a purpose and outcomes and a process, just at the top, what are we practicing here? And is that integrated? And so, it might be emergent strategy philosophies, but it might be other things as well.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Charlene. I think about the liberating structures. I try to encourage folks to use those in our meetings to try and, shake up the technocratic agenda setting that we end up so often falling into. So are there ways in simple meeting structures that we can shake things up? Are we practicing those things, and do they become second nature? So I really appreciate that. I'm wondering, with our time left, we have just a moment. Can I send it over to Patty and Mary for our closing poem?
So I'll say for me, Sarah, one of the things I'm going to do tomorrow and Monday is spend some time with this poem that Mary and I are getting ready to share with you. I did not know it until we prepared for this session, and it emerged from this fellowship, and I value it deeply. So thank you all for giving this gift to me. One of my activities is to turn it into action. Mary?
The Sea by David White. The pull is so strong, we will not believe the drawing tide is meant for us. I mean the gift, the sea, the place where all the rivers meet.
It's easy to forget how the great receiving depth, untamed by what we need, needs only what will flow its way.
Easy to feel so far away, and the body so old, it might not even stand the touch.
But what would that be like, feeling the tide rise out of the numbness inside toward the place to which we go?
Washing over our worries of money, the illusion of being ahead, the grief of being behind.
Our limbs, young, rising from such a depth.
What would that be like, even in this century, driving toward work with the others?
Moving down the roads among the thousands swimming upstream.
As if growing toward a rival, feeling the currents of the great desire, carrying time toward tomorrow?
Tomorrow seen today for itself.
The sea where all the rivers meet, unbound, unbroken, for 1,000 miles, the surface of a great silence.
The movement of a moment left completely to itself.
To find ourselves adrift, safe in our unknowing.
Our very own, our great tide, our great receiving.
Our wordless, fiery, unspoken, hardly remembered gift
of
true belonging. Thank you, friends.
Thank you all so much for spending this time with us. We really appreciate it.
And a final thanks from me, because I am reminded to thank the apps team for, again, bringing your wisdom and your always connective, positive energy to the Imagining America community. Every app session is so deep and so thoughtful. I really appreciate it and appreciate you who joined this session. We have a brief break as we move in our gathering flow from the headwaters in through the channels, through the evening or afternoon plenary, which will be a pleasure to join the Wind and the Warrior Collective, which is a collective of healing artists who will show how their water work builds practices of solidarity, collectivity, and liberation. So it should be a really great experience at 3:30 Pacific time. And do look up and see if there's space. And Charlene, our participant colleague, here's Jellyfish Joy movement session tomorrow morning. It should be amazing. I sadly have to go to the IA get together, so I don't get to go. So those of you who have that opportunity, don't miss it. So anyway, thank you apps team so much. Really amazing work as usual.
Thank you so much. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Be safe, everybody.